over here and joining us on our 15th session of Stories We Live By. Today we have a very eminent guest with us, Mr. Obaidullah Baheer. Baheer is an academician, belongs to the prominent intelligentsia of Afghanistan, face of the youth, upcoming youth in Afghanistan as well. Baheer is a philanthropist. He graduated from Australia, came back to Afghanistan, started teaching over there. And when things started getting very, and Taliban took over last year, on this very same day, Baheer was there. He witnessed a lot of happenings that were going over there with his own eyes. Today we are going to have a conversation with him and we'll try to understand what the youth of Afghanistan is thinking about the future of Afghanistan. So, starting from your background, where if you can tell us about yourself, about your background, from where you studied, why did you come back to Afghanistan and you had a chance of a bright future in some foreign country, and you are serving your country now?
Thank you for having me. Salman has always been very kind friend. Thank you all for being here and giving me your precious time. I think the question as to who I am is probably one of the most difficult questions anyone can be asked. Does just anyone really know who they are? But besides the politics, I guess something that is a question that I tackle with always is the question of who I would be if I wasn't born to the family that I am born to, or born to the country and the circumstances that I'm born to. Because you do realize that a lot of ways that our psychological makeup is built is because of our genetics. You literally carry the trauma of your parents and your ancestors. So, just keeping that in mind, I wonder if my grandfather had never decided to start a Muslim youth movement in Afghanistan. I wonder if my father hadn't spent 6.5 years in detention, or even before he married my mother, to have spent 2 years in detention at that time. I wonder who he would be as a person. I wonder who I would be as a person if that were the case. I guess you guys would have heard this statement very often, "Afghani ab mehnati hai," right? And it's true. And that's because I think people who grow up among challenges tend to work the extra mile. And Afghans have been like that. And our circumstances make us who we are. I was someone who grew up in exile. I visited Afghanistan back in the Civil War days, and I have a few dark memories of it, but it was a place that felt like home. So when I was done with my postgraduate studies in Australia, I had the option of settling there. I have family there. But the question was that if I decided to settle there, I would probably have never returned. And I knew that Afghanistan was an opportunity window that was closing. So by virtue of privilege, whatever I had learned was something that I had to give back to my people, to my society. So I flew back to Afghanistan and I permanently settled there. And then the question of why I decided to stay there despite the circumstances, I think is, in dire circumstances, the question isn't about how many you can save, the question is whether you can save one, right? So the equation is save one, save all. And we could do that in Afghanistan before August 15th, after August 15th, and that's necessarily why I stayed. And this is not to say that I condemn anyone that left, because that's a risk that you take upon yourself. And I thought that I had to stay, that some of us had to stay back because some people had to make sense out of it.
So we talk about your family. How much do you think that you are family right now? And if you can tell about your family, your history to the audience.
Well, I always like to introduce myself with a poem in Arabic that says, "In al-fata man yaquluha ana wa laysa al-fata man yaqulu laka abi." A man is he who says, "Here I am," not one that says, "Oh, that is my father." Right? But again, context matters, and there is certain baggage, whether you see that as a positive thing or a negative thing, that is our family and the strata we belong to. I am the grandson of ex-Prime Minister Obaidullah, who is the founder of the Islamic youth movement in Afghanistan back in the 60s and 70s. He ended up leading one of the biggest political and jihadi parties against the Soviet Union. And then after that, we had our role within the Civil War. So there's a lot of mixed history there that one has to tackle with. But I guess generationally, my grandfather being the jihadi military political leader, and then my father the diplomat, and then there's Obaidullah, who's an academic. So I guess whatever that legacy is, it's a legacy that's hopefully heading towards something a tad bit more sustainable, or where we minimize the cost of our decisions and hopefully make sure that the next generation has it better than us.
So it should be more constructive in the future. Your father's story, that is very interesting. You told me about it one day, and it is a story that is worth listening. It has a lot of lessons, not only for the honor of Afghan, but also for the audience who are in Pakistan. What happened after 9/11? Why was he detained? What happened with him in the prison? How did it affect your family, you in particular, and how is it now affecting your overall your future plans in Pakistan?
9/11 was quite an odd experience because growing up, we'd grown up in an environment, in a family, and you have to understand that the global trend back then was that jihad is good, Soviets are bad, which necessarily meant that as children, we at home used to record on those cassette tapes. So we pick up cassette tapes and record our own episodes on them. So those were stories that we would make up. So I remember very distinctly that one of the stories was my sister would be acting the mother, and me and my brother would be the two mujahideen who would be going to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, and then he would get shot at, and then I would return to my mother and tell her that our brother has been martyred, and she would thank the Lord for the sacrifice of her son. So that's where we came from, and I studied in a Salafist school, so a lot of what we were studying was reinforcing that. My class fellow was Abdullah Azam's grandson, who was the ideological forefather of Bin Laden himself. So everything around us was reinforcing this belief that there was this grand enemy and this grand evil that we had to fight. And then 9/11 happened. And I remember I used to write this verse that one of the attackers on the 9/11 things used to write on his notebooks. He used to write this verse, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Verily, my prayers and my givings are all for the Lord, and to Him I shall return. So that's where we were. I was pumping my fists in the air at the scenes of 9/11, because that's what we had been taught. And then my grandfather declared a resistance movement against the US invasion in Afghanistan. He went into hiding, which necessarily put the target on my father, who was now second in command. Again, he was always a diplomat. He never fought, and he never wanted to fight, which is why he told us that they might come for him but he thought it would just be a house search. So I remember in my defiance spreading out all the pictures that I had of my grandfather in my cupboards to make sure that whoever came searching was triggered enough to be angry at it. And that's what happened. They came 3 a.m. at night, they rounded us all up in one room. It was the first time I've seen so many white people in one place. And they took everything. They took everything from a sheet of paper to hard disks to computers to telephone lines. And the one stark memory that I have of that day is, so I thought that it was all fun and games, and that's what an 11-year-old really sees the world as. And I ran into the corridor and I saw one of the officers ask my father to go with them. And my father, being the bougie person that he was like, I need to change out of my pajamas before I go with you. And they're like, we can't let you do that. And he's like, no, I'm actually changing. And he turns around, and that's when they moved the gun and pointed at him. And that wasn't a memory that was easy to have with myself for all those years. But what was worse was when he was taken, and God was kind to us. He kept giving us hope. We kept being told that he'll be released in a day, in a week, in a month. Months turned into years, years turned into 6, and eventually, I think the only thing that was making us suffer was the hope then. But just to know that my father was part of the 190 people who were put through the Learning Helplessness program, which necessarily was a program that the United States government bought off 2 psychologists who designed the program to train Navy officers to resist torture. So they reversed engineered their own program to make sure that they knew exactly how to break people. And learned helplessness means that I torture you to an extent that when you're left in this room and the door is open for you to leave, you do not get up and leave because you have learned to be proven to that extent. You have accepted your helplessness, which included waterboarding, burial in the ground, which meant sensory deprivation. So you were locked in a room with no light and no sound for days on end. And when the door opens, you have bright lights shone into your eyes. Then there's sleep deprivation. You're hung from ceilings. My father tells me that there was a point where he couldn't lift his jeans because he had fought on that week. And yeah, just seeing that, seeing the videos that were coming out of Abu Ghraib and Camp Gitmo necessarily meant that whatever radical trajectory we were on was just multiplied into a few. And which necessarily meant that we were willing to do anything and everything to set the score straight. So that was basically the journey of my father. And when he had returned, I reached my peak of hatred for the West and whatever it stood for. And that was when first semester of university, undergraduate, I went to him 6 months after his release, and I told him that I was willing to go to Afghanistan, and I'd set everything up, and I was going to go and fight there. And I think what he said then really left an impact that grew with me. And his line was, on one end, he emotionally blackmailed me, telling me that he was going to be abducted and taken again if I went. But on the other end, something that made sense was when he told me that things weren't as black and white as I thought they were. Right? And this was coming from a man who had been put through 6.5 years of American detention, right? And through their torture programs. So for me, that was something very profound. And I kept asking myself this question: why did this man say this thing, right? And that's when you realize that very often this very clear distinctions of right and wrong and black and white that we have aren't really that straight. And there's always so much layering to it and so much determinism to it, which means that we're acting in certain ways because we have these lenses that are given to us and they're not even our own, right? So that helped me. Initially, it was very difficult because when I stopped being this potential jihadi person, I didn't know who I was. And you have this moral incongruence, this identity crisis where you're standing under the shower wondering why you're even alive, and that's an existential crisis. A lot of people get it in their 30s. I got it in my early 20s, so hoo-ha. But it isn't pleasant because you have to really then begin and find out who you are, and I become this very different person. And I didn't know who these two people were anymore and whether I could survive like that, and you never want to be two people at the same time. This is why eventually I had to come to a position where I could reconcile my own truth and become these two people at once. And that was exemplified in my life in Kabul the past few years, because if you go on Darlaman Road, which is like your blue area road, right, and there's a palace at the end, which is for you, each for us, it's a Darlaman Palace. And on the end of Darlaman Road, on the left side is the American University, which was the center of liberal studies where I was lecturing. And on the right side of the road was my grandfather's compound, where we would have a few hundred people at the same time, who were all Ikhwanis, who all believed in an Islamic system of governance, right? And I belonged to both worlds, and I would shuttle between both of them. And I would make both of them uncomfortable, because the goal was to show them that there was another side that they had to see and accept, right? And that's what reconciliation is. And that was probably one of the reasons I stayed after August 15th, because I thought if I could do it on a small scale, then maybe Afghanistan could do it on a much larger national scale.
It was a surprise for me as well when I visited your grandfather his compound, and I saw the American University just across the street opposite to his compound. About your driver, who became the assistant, we can say the second in command of your father when he was detained. He was also captured by the United States of Army, and he got martyred during the detention. Would you like to tell us about him and what you did for him afterwards for his family?
I think one of the logical fallacies that we, especially in the third world, really fall for is whataboutism, right? Whenever you ask me a question, I'm like, well, what about that, right? And it's a very easy way to get out of it. Some people call it red herring. There are a lot of themes to it. And I think sometimes we even get it from our religious stories as well, because if you look at Ibrahim alayhi salam and his story of Namrud, so he's arguing with his tyrant and he's telling him, you're not God, because my God brings the dead to life and takes the life of the living. And Namrud's like, well, that's not difficult. He calls two prisoners, one is sentenced to death, sets him free, and the other person is sentenced to death. And he's like, well, I've just done the same thing, so I don't know where your argument stands. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, rather than explaining how Namrud had violated the principle of the argument, that Ibrahim alayhi salam just turns around and he says, well, my God brings the sun out from the east, bring it out from the west. Right? And then his argument ends. But technically, Ibrahim alayhi salam commits a red herring in this argument. It's just that when you identify it, you can get the upper hand in the argument. If you don't, then you lose the argument in some sense. And a lot of times when I do criticize the Taliban, right, criticize any side, you would always have this one person who would jump up and say, where were you when this was happening, right? And that's the classic whataboutism. And I have Taliban followers, some of which actually respect my work, others that would ask this question, where were you in this 20 years of occupation? And I don't like to answer it in detail, but we were actually pursuing legal cases against the people who designed the torture program, right? So we had a case filed in New York against the two psychologists that designed this program because one of my mentors, father figures growing up, was a man called Abdul Rahman, and he was basically, his task was to make sure we were okay. Because when my father would be traveling, he would be taking us to school, bring us back, cater to everything that we needed. Eventually, as time passed, he became my dad's secretary, and then when 9/11 happened and my grandfather went into hiding, he went away as well. And we knew where he went. And I had seen him months later at our house, and that night when the the house was raided, he was taken away as well. And he ended up becoming the first CIA detainee to be tortured to death. And they only disclosed that 6 years later, right? And that was the first official death that happened at the hands of those people who were committing torture. So initially we tried to go after the US government, but that didn't make sense, so we eventually went after the psychologists, and it's a very detailed court hearing. I was actually telling Salman about this. One of the reasons why I can read legal documents so well is because I had to go through the transcripts of every hearing. At the end of the day, the only thing the family wanted was to know where he was buried. He was dead, but the only thing that they wanted to know was where his physical body was. And they never told us. We managed to settle in the case, but it was important to at least get that little bit of justice for a person who had basically been denied a very, very inalienable right of defending oneself, because you should be innocent until the court of law tells you that you are.
Back in Mr. Navigation, you spend a lot of time with your family over in Pakistan. Tell us about your experience in Pakistan, and how do you see the relation between Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially in the context of the hostility that the two countries go for each other?
I have fond memories of Pakistan because, again, where you grow up really does impact you. And I was 6 years old when I first came to Pakistan. Until I did my undergraduate degree here, it was a lot of life to live in one place. And I think that we're not too different. I mean, not in the general cosmopolitan sense where we would read when we're apart, but necessarily culturally as well, and with our identities as well. I mean, the fact that the largest ethnicity in Afghanistan is in a much larger number in Pakistan. It shows you how closely linked we are. So we are joined at the hips, whether we like it or not. And there are always going to be people that are going to benefit from exploiting our differences. Like we've had those on either side of the borders. And the goal then is to appease a specific population, chase after a specific agenda, but governments and people come and go, right? Nations stay, races, people stay. And it's really important to remember that, because I remember writing to a very high official during the Republic days, and I wrote them a policy paper in which I said, I understand this narrative that you are peddling off the Taliban being foreign proxies or Pakistani proxies, but the problem is you will not be around tomorrow, and our people will still need Pakistan, because our people will still be at the border, will still be standing at the embassy, will still want to get access to Pakistan, but they wouldn't be able to, because this politics would have murky the waters, right? And it's unfortunate. But on the other end, we also have to remember that it really does matter what reaction you receive at your lowest point, right? Because if you want to really know your friends, just look around at your lowest point and figure out who treated you kindly. And here's something that I've been criticizing. We very often hear this argument, and I'm not a big fan of this, either the Pakistani bloc or the Indian bloc, like Afghanistan doesn't have its agency to decide its own foreign policy. But I am a huge fan of non-aligning or having a balanced foreign policy, because everyone's going to want their own national interests secured, and you should never make a neighbor that you can't get rid of insecure in that sense, right? But that being said, we very often used to hear this rhetoric of, India's influence is increasing in Afghanistan. And you need to understand that if you wanted to an Indian visa in Afghanistan, there was an office in Shadana, which is literally the heart of the city, which was extremely well done. It was air conditioned. You would walk in, you would get your token. It was like one of your government offices here that are now digitized and modernized, right? But when you would want a Pakistani visa, you would go outside the embassy, stand in the heat for hours, and then you would have someone either take money and then passports would be thrown over the wall and then so on and so forth, right? And that's just one part of it. And this isn't just before August 15th, this is stuff that still happens in Afghanistan. Pakistani visas are sold for $1,000 each in Afghanistan right now, right? And then you have the issue of the border where people spend nights at the border just trying to get through, right? So it's just this modification of behavior that's going to get us so far, because the grand politics can be whatever they are, but it's at the end of the day the human interaction, the people-to-people interaction that really make a difference. It's gatherings like these, it's work like what Salman does, which is very important. This is a discussion we almost had a year ago where I told him that unless there was work on people-to-people interaction, we were just going to keep drifting apart. And then the populist leaders are always going to cash that in, because you want an enemy, you want another, and that's very Machiavellian. The prince always needs an enemy, right? And there always has to be an existential threat for you to fight against. But it's not too late, and it's not like we have an option, right? And like, if you had an option of opting out, or if you could move to another continent and me to another, then fair enough, let's just do that, right? But we can't, and we will have to keep living with each other. And this is probably the lowest time for Afghanistan, economically, politically as well. And it's really important as to what Pakistan as a nation, as a state, choose to Afghanistan, because this will decide how things will progress. Because you have to also look at the limitations of the Taliban. Because the Taliban have been stamped as a proxy of Pakistan, sometimes they tend to overcorrect for that, right? And they're forced to take stances where they just make it look like they're very independent and that they can defy Pakistan, right? But it doesn't need to be these two extremes, right? It could be a relationship that's built on mutual interest and mutual respect, right? We could head there if we want to.
So today marks the 1 year of Taliban. You were there in Kabul. You spent most of your time out there doing some philanthropic work. How do you see that in the last 1 year Taliban fared with the people of Afghanistan? What is the mood over there? How do you see the youth of Afghanistan see their future in the country? I've heard that many Afghan youngsters who were residing in the Western country now they are trying to come back to Afghanistan, trying to interact with the government over there, the entire government, and trying to play their part in rebuilding of their country. So do you think that Taliban are welcoming, they are accommodating, and they are going to give some kind of opportunity to the youngsters to play their positive role for the country? And to add to this question as well, about the girls' education, you not only you, but many people I've seen online and in some other occasions as well, that they are very pro-Taliban, but they criticize them for this policy for girls' education. So what do you have to say about that?
Look, one thing that I want you guys to be mindful of, right? How many of you here would want TTP to come to power? Right? So it's just that I want us to be mindful of that, right? Because whenever we're looking at Afghanistan, we have to understand that you here are a minority, right? You literally represent less than 10% of Pakistan, right? And the urban educated elite of Afghanistan represented an even smaller fraction, right? Which necessarily means that when the Taliban came to power, yes, the lives of the rural population didn't really change much. But for the urban educated non-Taliban people, their worlds flipped upside down, right? Imagine when you're in a situation where you're told you cannot travel without a male guardian, where you cannot work in specific sectors, where you're told that your dress is like this or that, or that you can study, and so on and so forth, right? So these are real problems that we have to acknowledge. But does that mean that that's the end of the world? Does that mean that we should all just like go around the streets screaming our lungs out and doing nothing? No, that means that it is a difficult situation that we should deal with. That said, we should be mindful of generalizations, because like I said, that there is a proportion of the population that has been very directly affected, but then there's another population that hasn't been, right? So the rural woman in a village in Urgun, which is my area, her life is still the same. She doesn't care if it's the Taliban patrolling the roads or it was the Republic, right? So we have to be careful of whose experience we are generalizing, or if we're generalizing at all. That said, one of the opportunities in Afghanistan right now, and this is something we haven't had for 40 years, is that there is a high level of safety and security in the country. This is something we haven't had. Because in the past 2 years, I've been trying so hard to go to my own area of Afghanistan, which is very close to the border of Marna, because I wanted to build something there, because I wanted to help my people. But I couldn't go, because no matter how many convoys the government would promise me, someone would tell me that the Taliban will outdo that and I will be ambushed, right? So I couldn't really access my area. But now I could sit in my car and 6 hours later I could be in my village doing whatever work I do, right? And that's a golden opportunity. How is that a golden opportunity? Because the problem isn't the TTP, the problem isn't the Taliban, the problem is the circumstances that create room for such thinking to foster and such radicalism to develop, right? So unless we challenge that and change that, nothing is going to fundamentally change. Because you tried artificially changing it by coercion and force for 20 years in Afghanistan, and it didn't stick. So now we have an opportunity of doing it differently, organically, more sustainably. So we have to keep that in mind. That said, we very often do fall into the trap of saying, and this is someone who was discussing this the other day, saying, oh, August 15th came and we would have celebrated the Taliban coming to power if they hadn't banned girls from going to school, right? And I think that's unfair, because it's not like if girls' school would be open tomorrow that all our problems would go away. I just yesterday had a conversation with 3 people, 2 of whom journalists, that were tortured for covering A, demonstration, B, a site of the drone strikes, one of which had a gun pointed at them. I talked to another person who spent 50 days in Taliban detention being tortured, his ribs broken. Why? Because he had written a post on Facebook that triggered the Taliban, right? And these are very real problems. And unless we start addressing them now, they're just going to keep getting worse, because that's the nature of government or regimes. They want power. They will keep demanding more and more power unless they're kept in check. And the fact that Afghanistan doesn't have a constitution, we don't have laws, we don't have norms, because everything changed and everything was uprooted, means that there's so much more to do before we can get to the point where we can have at least some form of interaction. So it's as simple as this. Today, if you and I go out and protest on the street here, there's certain laws that dictate what we can and cannot do. But then even beyond that, when you and I are taken to the station, there are certain norms which are unwritten rules that dictate how you and I are going to be dealt with. And the problem with new regimes is they throw out the book and they throw the baby out with the bathwater, and at the end of the day, you have to start afresh. And I know it's going to take time to establish the constitution, to establish laws, but at least we can start talking about norms. And that happens when international community and international players sit across the Taliban and say, hey, these are people who are dissidents, but they don't want to fight you. They want their rights. These are activists, right? And so on and so forth. And these are the norms of engagement that you should have with each other. We will ask them to not do A, B, C, which are provocative to you, but you should not do DEF so that you do not hurt them or undermine their rights, right? And that's how engagement starts, because we have to understand the Taliban are new to us. They're coming to power after 20 years of us seeing them as this elusive dark force. And they see us as this elusive entity that is extremely godless and promiscuous, and God knows what was happening in Afghanistan's cities and institutes. Both aren't true. At the end of the day, we're both Afghans who've just never gotten to sit across each other. The first time on August 15th, I went out on the road. While so many people were hiding themselves, I got off my car, I walked up to one of the Taliban who had a rocket launcher on his shoulder, and I tapped him on the vacant shoulder that he had, and I was like, "Who's your commander?" And he was like, "That guy." And I was like, "I need to talk to him." So I went to him, he had 20 men, and he looked super sleep deprived, like his eyes were bloodshot, he was eating a stale piece of bread. And I was like, Commandant, which means commander, I was like, "Listen, people are scared. People are inside their houses. They can't get out because they think that you guys are killing anything that moves. That's not the reality of the city. But if you do me a favor, I could record a video of you right now and post it on social media, and people will know better. People will start coming out, right?" And he was like, "Okay, but I need to check with my superiors." So he made a call, and the superior said, "No media appearances," because some Taliban had said stupid things on media before that. So they're like official channels only. So he was like, "I'm sorry, I can't do it." And when I was walking away, he turned and called after me, and he said, "Ustaz," which means teacher. And he's like, "Take my number in case anyone bothers you, call me." So I smiled at him and I said, "I don't think anyone's going to bother me." But this interaction in itself is how you humanize each other. Because he got to interact with an American university lecturer, which to him was the biggest of kuffar that he could have imagined. And he saw me speaking his language, knowing his culture, being very much like him. And I saw him as a human being who was sleep deprived, who was still trying to guarantee security on the morning of the takeover. So it's just this one interaction at a time, right? The Taliban have been exposed to the cities after 2 decades, and they're interacting. I've seen that change. I've seen that in the checkpoints. And Jeffrey Goldfarb is an amazing academic and writer who writes about checkpoints and how they signify the state's relation with the people. And the first few days when the checkpoints would stop you and you would even look at them in an unpleasant way, that was cause for trouble, because then your car was going to get searched, you were going to get searched, so on and so forth, right? And now that they have uniforms, they've gone through 6 months of training, and they've been told how they should interact with people, it's a whole different experience, right? And it's not just the training, it's because they got exposed to these people, right? And the people got exposed to them. So that feeling in your heart where you don't really like this person, but you have to deal with them, that's sort of dissipating, right? And that's the beginning of integration. I wish it was better. I wish we had a program. I wish we had a peace settlement, but none of that happened, and the Taliban are now in power. So we have to figure out how to move forward.
You talk about the political differences, but there is another thing that is prevailing in our region, say in Pakistan and Afghanistan. That is the big differences between different ethnicities. We also face this monster, but when I was in Afghanistan and I interact with Afghans, I feel that there is a very wide gap between different ethnicities over there, especially between the northern and the southerns. So how do you see that will play a major role, a constructive or destructive role in the future of Afghanistan? Especially when the Taliban are in power and they are predominantly Muslims.
The issue is that very often we have two things to keep in mind, right? One is that generally Afghanistan has never had time to nation build, right? And that's a very fundamental part of a nation. Why did so many people carry flags in Pakistan yesterday, sing songs? The flag is a construct, the nation is a construct, but somehow you feel this certain pull towards it, this certain sense of identity, right? Because the past 70 years have been part of this nation building, this identity that has been given to you. I mean, China has done that in an extremely unhealthy way, where they kept moving populations and your ethnic identity eventually got lost, and now you're just known as this white Chinese person, and that helped them because there is just such a huge population that if it were diverse, it would be very difficult to contain. That's just one part of it. Afghanistan, unfortunately, due to the constant turmoil it has gone through, it has never developed that true, or to a large extent, especially within the educated elite, where there's a sense of belonging to Afghanistan, or being an Afghan, right? There is that issue on one side. And the other issue is just this global trend of reactions, right? And we very often, when we talk about globalization, we tend to see it as a very modern phenomenon, but it's not. I mean, it comes all the way from Aristotle, where you had talk of cosmopolitanism and being a global citizen, and how your loyalty wasn't just to your tribe, but beyond that. And the problem with that is very often people at some point stand up and feel like, wait, why am I sacrificing my benefits for someone that I don't really care for, right? And that's where populism comes in. That's why people like Trump found a following, because they started saying things that were popular amongst a crowd that felt oppressed, right? And especially with regards to ethnic tensions now in Afghanistan, there are a lot of people who are exploiting this opportunity of there not being stability in Afghanistan, or being a vacuum of political control within the country, and they use this to make it look like it is an ethnic matter, right? The Taliban having a majority of the Pashtuns amongst them doesn't necessarily mean that the Pashtuns are Taliban, right? And that's a reality that has to be said and it has to be addressed. So this is not a Pashtun hegemony project, because the fighting for the past 20 years was majorly in the Pashtun areas. The Pashtuns died on the side of the Taliban and on the side of the Republic, right? So they were the major casualties of the war. And it's not like they gained much from this power that they've had. You have to understand that the current government is exclusively Taliban. It doesn't necessarily mean that every Pashtun is having the best day of their lives now that the Taliban are in power. That being said, Afghanistan has ethnic tensions that haven't been addressed, that have been exploited for the past 40, 50 years. And it's time now, and maybe we're just asking too much of the Taliban, but maybe not the Taliban, maybe the general larger population of Afghanistan, to fix this discourse and make sure we start having this conversation, which includes all the ethnicities. Because the first step of creating a political opposition or dissent is to formalize it, is to find commonalities. And I think if you guys have had a chance to read the book about how democracies fail, I think that's roughly the title by two Harvard professors. They specifically talk about the US and how Trump coming to power was probably the first failure of the US democracy. What they say is one specific thing that kept the United States democracy going was no matter what happened between opposition groups, there was always respect, right? And that really does matter. And very often in the politics of our third world, we sort of forget that principle. And we start seeing each other not just as opponents, but as enemies rather than as allies in the same cause, because there's just so much to be done, and Afghanistan can achieve so much if all these different flanks come together and we go across the Taliban and say, we're not your enemies. That's the secret of Mandela's success. People judged Mandela for learning the Afrikaner language. He was judged for wanting to befriend the enemy or the colonizer, right? One of the most controversial things that he ever did was when it came to rugby, they told him that they should kick out all the whites from the rugby team, and he said, no, we won't. They will play as part of the team, and we will have a merit system, right? And it just shows you that you cannot eradicate your opponent. Any ideology that makes you think that you can is lying to you, right? I mean, Marxism tells you that the proletariat will rise and the bourgeoisie will be overthrown. Where will the bourgeoisie go, right? So, and that's where the Gandhian concept of the Gandhian synthesis comes in, where when you and I have two very different visions, unless we can sit down and we can synthesize it into a vision, one vision, that is tolerable to both of us. Obviously, our power asymmetry is going to matter. I'm a lecturer, maybe I'm rich, you're not, so I get to call more of what it's going to look like. The Taliban are in power, they will get to have more of the same. But at the end of the day, if the Taliban think that they can exclude the larger, the educated non-Taliban urban population, then they're just going to cause more exodus, more brain drain, more hatred towards them, and an unsustainable future. So they have to make a decision, and we have to make a decision that the Taliban are now in power. Our ideal vision for Afghanistan is not going to be implemented, but we can start with something that is enough for us to breathe and start work today. And eventually we will grow out of it. Look at Iran and what Iran was like 40, 50 years ago. Today you have remnants of the Green Revolution where women took to the street and demanded their rights. Look at Saudi Arabia, one of the most conservative countries in the world. Today it is turning into a whole other world. Why? Because economic sense prevailed, right? So politics, empowerment, economic sense, education, these things are going to make a difference. And those are the avenues we will keep pushing the Taliban on. Because you don't go up to Shahid Afridi and challenge him to a game of cricket. You challenge Afridi to a game of chess where his intellect is going to defeat him, right? So the idea is don't play at people's strengths. And the Taliban's strength is violence, which is why today I as an activist refuse to go down that path. And I will fight that violence with non-violence. I will oppose that violence with non-violence. And eventually, sense will prevail. It will take time. Organic change takes time. But if you want something sustainable, and if you truly want something for your country, it's not going to be a magic bullet. It's not going to be a messiah that comes from outside. It's going to be work that you do today. It will be trees that you plant today that are going to grow 100 years later. And the pine nut tree is an extremely important example for Afghanistan and for its people. My area is known for its pine nuts. Do you know how long it takes for a pine nut tree to grow out of a seed and actually start giving you pine nuts? 100 years. 100 years later, it starts giving you pine nuts. And do you know why half of our mountains are barren and no one's planting pine trees there? Because they say, well, I'm not going to be around in 100 years, so what do I care? I have my trees and I'm going to live off them, right? And unless we can change that mentality about Afghanistan, unless we can start growing pine trees of hope today, even if we know we're not going to be the ones enjoying the pine nuts later, that's why this country is going to change.
Thank you so much, Ubaid. Not to talk about, not to hear from you, not to learn from you. But we'll go to the audience and we'll ask them if they have any questions from you. And then we'll conclude the session. Any questions? Introduce yourself and.
My name is Mohammed Shaikh. I'm with AUAF. I have 3 questions. So the first question is, what kind of settlement do you reach with those psychologists and ground? The second one is, your family has a history of being in the power party. Your father and your grandfather. Do you have any plans to go in the power party? The third question is, do you see Taliban as the future for Afghanistan? And if that is the case, what kind of, like in your opinion, what kind of growth structure would they adopt? Will it be a democracy or will it be authoritarian?
With regards to the settlement, I am legally obligated not to disclose that information, so NDA stops us from doing that. With regards to politics, there's an interesting quote that says some people are born to politics, others are dragged to it. So sometimes we don't really have a choice. And I think politics itself is a very vague term as well. I don't know if the work that I'm doing right now qualifies as politics because I try not to look at it from the lens of what it gets me. Because if I were saying what was popular, I would be saying very different things. If I was saying what was going to get me into power, I'd be saying very different things. So right now, and I hope that stays the same, the goal is much bigger than myself and what I can get out of it. And the goal is to do something that is worthwhile for the country and the people. With regards to the Taliban, again, predicting the future is no absolute science, and it's very tricky. If things keep going the way that they are, it's not very hopeful, and we might actually end up. Look, because we're already standing on the edge, you need to understand that the Taliban don't have an infinite amount of land, as much as they want to believe that in two ways. One is the larger national grievances. Right now, there's an asymmetry of capabilities. That means even if I don't like the Taliban, I don't have the power to do anything about it. But at some point, grievances reach a level where your capabilities become irrelevant. Suicide bomber analogy. You have nothing, a cat cornered cat, which will do whatever it can to even cause the least amount of harm. That is one issue that the Taliban would seriously have to think about. In the history, past 200 years of Afghanistan has shown that there are many more stronger tyrants that were overthrown by the larger population when they were displeased. One. Number two, the international community is not going to wait forever. And you have to realize that right now we're lucky where Afghanistan is not a very polarizing issue in the US politics specifically, but at some point it might become so. And when it does, then whenever you would have the parties switch power, you would have very drastic policy changes towards Afghanistan, which would also include endorsement of militant resistance groups against the Taliban. Doesn't mean the Taliban will be overthrown, but it means that we will go towards more and more conflict and the suffering will prolong. So the Taliban really have to decide right now. And I'm not asking them, no one's asking them to say that they're going to make a liberal utopia out of Afghanistan. They don't have to, right? The international community is willing to compromise to such an extent that at the beginning of the year they used to call for an inclusive government from the Taliban. Then midway through the year they realized that the Taliban weren't going to give them an inclusive government, and they called it a participatory government, which necessarily meant pick people that are like you, but at least they're not Taliban and put them in the government, and we're going to be happy with that, right? So the international community is willing to compromise on a localized version of governance and democracy or whatever you have in Afghanistan. But the Taliban also have to realize whether they're willing to go beyond and stop staring at their toes and look ahead a little, expand their social contract, include the larger population of Afghanistan, start appeasing them rather than their own fighters, right? And then work out compromises. Not everything is a sacred value. Sometimes you hear the Taliban obsess over, oh, if I did this, ISKP is going to publish something about how I collaborate with the West. So what? Which country in the world doesn't collaborate with the West, right? ISIS tried to do that in Iraq and Syria, and look where it got them, right? So isolationism isn't the way forward. So ultimately, the decision is with the Taliban. We can keep pushing them, the international community can keep pushing them, but they get to decide what the future looks like. मुश्किल सवाल क्या एक्स्ट्रा कर सकते
Thank you for being here and enlightening us with two interesting stories. My question is a bit personal. Given your family background, audit suspect, whether it comes to Western education or it's just values. Now, my question is does this orthodox religious background has any obstructions in your journey of getting higher education? I mean, you are able to get higher education, so can it be attributed to the fact that you were born in an influential family, or as you mentioned earlier, things are not as like in what as normally depicted? Thank you.
I would like to add something to this question. This is the real profession about Himalayasa. He's just a Himalayas and Islam, and he just know how to pull the trigger. But I think many people don't know that he is also an academician, and there are almost 100 plus books with him. So if you would like to add this to your answer properly.
Look, I think what was interesting to me was initially when I came back to Afghanistan, because I was part of the peace deal that was signed between Hizb Islami and the Republic. I actually held the final signed document before I had to leave for Australia. So I never saw my grandfather return the day that he returned. But we had a phone call, and it was quite interesting because unlike a lot of my other cousins or my grandfather's grandchildren, everyone's very formal with him. At the end of the day, he is a figure that is revered by quite a few. But I've never had that kind of relation with him. Like, I've always been that grandson who used to annoy him and joke with him. And I think he even finds that very hard because no one else does that with him. And when I called him from Australia, there were conversations like, oh, I wish I was there, I would hug you, I would kiss your hand. And he was like, oh, and I would kiss your head. And my dad's just like, how are you so frank with him? You've like barely written him a few letters in the past few years. I'm like, because he's family, like I can't. And for me, it was interesting because a lot of the media appearances I was giving and a lot of literature that I was writing didn't really fall in line with his thinking. And I thought maybe he wasn't reading them because he wasn't giving me a reaction where he would say, why are you saying these things? But I eventually figured out that he was literally reading everything that I was writing. He was seeing everything that I was saying. And I guess just this conversation, initial conversation that I had with him coming back was saying, you have your political legacy and you have your own history, and I'm going to chart my own path. I'm not a member of your party. I am not going to carry that legacy. I will do my own thing. But I'll always be here as your grandson. And I think that's sort of this arrangement that we have where I do my own thing, he does his own thing, and principally we don't have a major clash. It's just that we both have very different paths and different ways of viewing the problem. And that's fine. I think that's an interesting form of tolerance that I've seen in him. But yes, it's always, when you're looking through the looking glass, you see a very different person, which is why I've encouraged a lot of people to sit down with him and talk to him, because history is ugly. History has made a lot of good people do bad things, and bad things have happened across the board. But the question now is that unless you have a very fair system of justice, then fine, bring everyone to it and let's settle the score and move forward. But if you don't, then I don't like selective hypocrisy. Then if you are going to accept other people who had a role to play in that history of Afghanistan, then you cannot deny that to him, especially considering his standing in Afghanistan today. And the fact that he is one of the very few people within Afghanistan right now who is revered by the Taliban, but he also says things that are critical of the Taliban. And that's very important because at the initial stages of when you don't have opposition parties or civil society, it's religious institutions and it's people that are revered that take up the first stance. Because the Taliban aren't going to listen to me to that extent because again, I don't belong to their imagined community. They can't relate to me, they will not accept information from me. But when they look at Hikmatyar and Hikmatyar having 140 books to his name, half of which are about religion, when he says something that challenges the Taliban discourse, then that has an impact, right? So we have to give weight to that role that he's playing, whether you like Hikmatyar or not. That's irrelevant, right? Because again, the conversation is much bigger than individuals and people. So we have to be mindful of that. But yeah, I mean, there's always, everything comes with a price tag. I mean, the name that I carry, the legacy that I carry, a lot of people think that it comes with a lot of benefits, but very often the costs are much higher than the benefits that you receive, which means that you are viewed much critically than another person would be. And sometimes I wish that I was this person that wasn't noticed, but you don't get to choose that, right? We didn't choose to be born, we didn't choose to be where we are, and now you have to decide whether you're going to make something out of it or not.
Anyone else? Right. We already had, so I would request Mr. Ambassador Nirasa to please say a few words of thanks to Mr. Baheer.
So I wondering, and I think you said one particular thing right before the beginning, that in this universe, we never came to the family we were born into. I mean, we were born into a particular family, but the most important thing is we still need to know the future. He's a typical example. He went abroad, studied. He had all the options available to him. Carry the legacy of the family, be a part of the family. Or believe in what he believes in and try to propagate that. And I think, I was listening to what you said. We all are very quick and we want quick fixes, but I don't think there are quick fixes in that. Either there is a way of revolution or there is a way of evolution. So if you go by the second way, it takes ages. It could take months, it could take years, it could take decades. You believe in something, I think that's the most important thing. And honestly speaking, I really think that Afghanistan is a country which can only come out of its own turmoil by its own people. There are no important solutions. And I was talking to some of you earlier, and I used a word which was revival, customs, traditions. We all have our own values, a value system, a tradition, and culture. So they can't be any imported solutions, at least in my opinion. Sitting in some form of capital in an eight-country room, you cannot give out suggestions and recommendations to change a country. Because the country is what the people want it to be. And the country will only accept the change which is in line with its culture and its social values. I wish you best in your endeavors. And I think the Afghan people are very resilient. At least when I was about to start my career, it was a Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And when I ended my diplomatic career, it was when the Taliban took over what they gave up after 9/11. So, you can say in a way, it came full circle. So, I think the path to Afghanistan's future lies with the people of Afghanistan. And I've always maintained, and I've always argued with my researchers, some of whom are here, that yes, the man is there. Okay. Because the basic thing is that you have to understand the Taliban also. They're not the same Taliban. they have learned, but you said something very interesting there. You actually said that, like, it's not what they have to tell their own people, but like, the Taliban also have to deal with the population. And in my analysis, I think there are now segments within the Taliban which think differently. The Talibans who sit on the negotiating tables, who travel abroad, the Talibans who are there at the national level, and the post soldiers. So I think the thinking at all the three levels is not the same. And as far as Afghanistan is concerned, let the Afghans decide what is good for them. Let them decide what is the future. The world should simply support what the Afghan people want. They want humanitarian assistance, they want technical assistance, they want knowledge of how the world is moving right now. You can only provide that, but let the Afghans decide what they want for themselves. Thank you very much. It was really enlightening, and I hope you will continue to visit us in the future. Thank you.